tell you a medrash. There's many ways I have personally explained this medrash, but what's relevant to us today is the following. Medrash says like this: Rabbi Akiva hayadorish. Rabbi Akiva was giving a drasha, he was giving a class, a shiur to his students, who bikshu hatalmidim lenamneim, and the students began to doze off. Nothing has changed in 2,000 years. Ubikesh laoraram, and Rabbi Akiva wanted to awaken them, wanted to wake them up. So he said to them the following: Maroa saw Esther. What did Esther see? Shemolcha al me'ah v'eshrin v'sheva medinos, that she was able to rule over 127 provinces. Tavo Esther bas bita shel Sara shechoisa me'ah v'eshrin v'sheva shanim. Let Esther, the great-great-granddaughter of Sara Imenu, who lived 127 years, come and rule over 127 provinces. So they all woke up. What in the world is there a connection between the 127 years of Sarah and the 127 provinces of Esther, except that they're the same number? And Rabbi Akiva went on. Now it's unreasonable to assume that Rabbi Akiva just wanted to astound them with something that made no sense. There must be something, a message that Rabbi Akiva was giving them to wake them up that was causing them to doze off. Let me tell you what I think. I think is the following. We know that because Torah is revealed knowledge, it's not accumulated knowledge, but it's revealed knowledge. There's a concept of Yeridas Hadoros, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu got the Torah at Har Sinai, and he gave over what he could to Yoshua, but inevitably he couldn't give over everything that he had, the same intensity, so the intensity went down a little bit. So Yoshua was already a little bit less. Yoshua gave it over to the Zkenim, and it was a little bit less. It loses something as it's given over. It's like electricity. It starts at the powerhouse, but then as it goes through, if you don't have transformers to continue strengthening it, it gets less and less and less, and it decreases the power of the current. So too, in the Mesorah, where you are dealing with revealed knowledge that started at an intense point at Har Sinai, every generation is a little bit less than the generation before. That's called Yeridas Hadoros. However, there are times in history where that lessening, that changing is more intense. It doesn't go just small from one generation, a little bit less to the next generation, a little bit less, but it is a very marked, intense Yerida, intense lessening from the generation before. Certain events in history or whatever caused that, or whatever, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, right, going into Golus caused that. That while Jews were all in Eretz Yisrael and able to have good times, right, peaceful times, the what's it called, the Rambam says about Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, that until his time, people were in Eretz Yisrael and things were fine. They were on a very high level and they could keep the Torah. Generation after generation went down slightly, but not intensely. There was a point, though, because they went into exile, because the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed or whatever, that the Yerida from one generation to another was marked, was very intense. And that's what happened when the Tanoim and the break to Amoraim in one generation. The Tanoim finished, the people who are the authors of the Mishnah, and then started those and the authors of the Gemara, was basically one generation. There was a little bit, Rav was considered a Tana and an Amora, but that generation divided, and they couldn't argue anymore. The people of the Gemara couldn't argue on the people of the Mishnah. They could argue with each other, but they couldn't argue on the generation before. Why not? The generation of the Mishnah spanned many generations. The last generation of the Tanoim, of the Mishnah rabbis, could argue on the first generation, generations before. And yet, at the immediate generation after the Mishnah finished, they couldn't argue anymore. So the Kesef Mishnah says is that they recognized in themselves that events occurred which made this Yeridas Hadoros, this lessening from generation to generation, more than one generation. It was like 20 generations in one generation because of the events that were. and they recognized they couldn't argue anymore. The difference between them and the people of the generation before was so great that they no longer had the power to argue on them. They accepted upon themselves. They recognized in themselves. An example, right? The Holocaust. If you look at the caliber of Tzaddikim, Talmidei Chachamim before the Holocaust, and the caliber after the Holocaust, of people who, right, even though there's a lot of Torah, but it's a tremendous difference, not just one generation difference. It's the Holocaust caused such a trauma that the level of Torah after the Holocaust, that immediate generation, was much, much lower than what existed before. So it's a fact. You can see the difference between the caliber of Talmidei Chachamim that existed and the caliber. And there are exceptions, they're individuals, but in the most part, the level is completely different. Completely different. Therefore, I would imagine that after the destruction of the Second Temple, same thing. The generation before the destruction was on a much higher level than the generation after the destruction of the temple. And that's what Talmidei Rabbi Akiva saw. They said they were the first generation born after the destruction. They lived around the 70 years after the destruction of the temple. That's Rabbi Akiva's time. And they were the first generation after the destruction of the temple. They looked at themselves, and they looked at the generation before, and they said, we're nothing. We're midgets compared to those people. And therefore, they felt that they couldn't be dynamic. They couldn't accomplish anything. The three sins that the students of Rabbi Akiva are accused of, are guilty of, three different medrashim. One is the most famous, Shelo nohagu kavod zeh b'zeh. They didn't respect each other. But there's two other sources. One says, Einehem tzara b'torasam. Literally, they were selfish with their Torah. They didn't share it one with the other. But it really means, Einehem tzara means they were narrow-minded with their Torah. They had a very narrow view of their Torah. Tzara b'torasam. And the third source says, they didn't fill Eretz Yisrael with Torah. They didn't go and spread their Torah to the whole of Eretz Yisrael. Those are the three things. If you think about them, they all revolve around one thing. They didn't feel their real importance. They felt very, very lowly. Why? Because they compared themselves to the generation before. The generation before were giants in Torah when the Beis HaMikdash still existed. We were born in a generation after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Malka v'soreho bagoyim ein Torah. The level of Torah when there is a temple and when there's no temple is completely different. So they looked at themselves and they said, who are we? What are we fit for honor? So they didn't honor themselves, they didn't honor each other with the honor that they really deserved. They honored each other more than we could possibly honor each other. But they didn't see the real greatness of themselves and the greatness of each other. So they didn't honor each other commensurate to what they deserved because they felt very lowly. We'll see in 1 second where the mistake was. They were right. They were at a much lower level. So what was the problem? And therefore, they looked at their Torah in a very narrow way and said, what's our Torah worth? The Torah of the generation before, look what that was. And look what we are. So we should share our Torah with others? What's it worth? Why waste people's time? We should go and spread our Torah to the Jewish people. What's our Torah worth? It all came from the same source. A lack of understanding of how important they were. They looked at themselves as very unimportant. And therefore they didn't respect each other with the level they should have. They didn't appreciate the value of their Torah. They were very narrow when they came to understanding the value of their Torah. And therefore they didn't feel that they should fill Eretz Yisrael and spread their Torah because they considered their Torah very lowly. What are we going to benefit people by spreading our Torah? All came from the same source. They were right. So what was the problem? The answer is the following. There's a Mabit, Yosef Mitrani, Moshe Mitrani, in his Sefer Beis Elokim. He asks the following question. He says, generations have prayed for Mashiach to come. The Nevi'im, the prophets prayed. They weren't answered. Didn't come because of them. And then the Tanoim, the authors of the Mishnah prayed. They weren't answered. Mashiach didn't come then. Amoraim, the authors of the Gemara prayed. Didn't come for them. Rishonim prayed. Right, Rashi prayed. Didn't come for him. Achronim, Rabbi Akiva Eger prayed. Didn't come for him. Who in the world do we think we are that we're going to pray and Mashiach should come for us? We might as well give up. If those people couldn't do it, how in the world do we think we're going to do it? What's the answer, says the Mabit? Yeah. You can have a midget that's compared to a giant as a nothing. He's a midget on the floor and this giant is a giant. But if you put the midget on the shoulders of the giant, he can reach farther than the giant can reach. We are midgets, but we're not looked upon as individuals. We're on the shoulders of giants. It's not one generation that's going to bring Mashiach, but it's the accumulation of all the prayers for all the generations. You can see already where we're going. That's going to bring Mashiach. Therefore, the Nevi'im, Tanoim, Amoraim, Rishonim, Achronim, all accomplished 99.99% of what's to be accomplished. We only have to add that extra 0.01% that we can do. We're a midget, but we're standing on the shoulders of a giant. We're not on the floor. And therefore, we can reach even farther than the giant because we have the giant underneath us. That's how a person has to look at Jewish history. Rabbi Akiva's students made that mistake. They understood that they were midgets compared to the generation before, but they forgot that they were a continuation of that generation. They're midgets, but they're standing on the shoulders of a giant of Jewish history that came before them. They didn't understand this idea of accumulation. You can understand now why I had a connection to Sfiras HaOmer, because that's the lesson of Sfiras HaOmer. You don't count days separately. You count the accumulation of all the days. And that's where they made their mistake. They didn't understand what Sfiras HaOmer is. The accumulation. It's not separate days. It's an accumulation. And that, I think, is the meaning of that medrash. The medrash says like this. Rabbi Akiva was doresh. Doresh doesn't really mean he was giving a shiur. It means that he was demanding from his students, be dynamic, do something, spread your Torah, share your Torah, understand who you are. Doresh. Doresh means to demand from something. Ubikshu hatalmidim lanamneim. Lanamneim does not mean to go to sleep. The Gemara says in Megillah and in Rosh Hashanah, if a person hears the Megillah or hears shofar and he's menamneim, so he's yotze. So it doesn't mean he's asleep, because you can't hear anything if you're asleep. What is menamneim? The Gemara says, tir velo tir, air velo air. You're asleep, but you're not asleep. Basically, you're not dynamic. If somebody says something to you, you can answer, but you won't initiate. You won't initiate a greeting, but you'll be able to answer to one. That's called, you're like in between. You're not awake, you're not sleeping, you're just not dynamic. That's what Bikshu Atalmidim Lanamnim. They didn't feel they could accomplish anything. Rabbi Akiva is Doresh. He's demanding from them, you have the ability to accomplish. And they're Menamnim. They're, we're okay, but we really can't accomplish. Who are we? We're nobody. Compared to the generation before, who are we? What's our Torah worth? They didn't respect each other with the level they should have respected each other. They looked at their Torah in a very narrow way, and they didn't feel that it's worth spreading their Torah to the Jewish people. Bikshu l'namni. Bikesh la'oraram. Rabbi Akiva wanted to awaken them and to let them know they're making a mistake. What did he tell them? What did Esther see? Now, Esther was in the same situation as you, he said. You're the first generation after the destruction of the second temple. Esther was the first generation after the destruction of the first temple. She should have felt the same way as you. She should have looked at the generation before and say, look at those giants, and what am I? A nobody. And she should have been totally inactive and not dynamic and not accomplished anything. So what did Esther see? that gave her the ability to rule over 127 provinces and to save the Jewish people. Why didn't she feel like you feel? Why didn't she feel a midget like you feel? What did she see that gave her the ability to rise above that? She saw Sarah Imenu. She realized, I'm not alone. I don't look at myself in a vacuum as an individual. I am part of a Masorah. I'm part of a tradition that started with Sarah Imenu. And I'm on her shoulders. All the generations after Sarah were on the shoulders of Sarah. So all these giants are together, and I'm a midget, but I'm on the shoulders of the top giant. So that makes me even bigger than the giant. And Sarah Imenu lived 127 years. Do you think every year is a separate thing? No. That's how the life of a person works. Every year is an accumulation of what you accomplished till then, and then goes on. You don't live 127 separate years, and that's what Chazal say. Kulam shavim l'tova. All of Sarah's years, her years accumulated. They were one accumulation, not separate things. So Sarah Imenu herself was an accumulation of 127 years. And therefore everything that came after her was an accumulation. It wasn't Sarah as an individual and then Rivka as an individual. It was Rivka on Sarah's shoulders. And Rachel and Leah on Rivka's shoulders. And all the way, and I'm on all of their shoulders. So I'm not a midget. I'm a midget if I'm standing on the ground. But I'm a giant, more than the giants, if I'm a midget standing on their shoulders. That's what Rabbi Akiva said. You know how Esther did not fall to the mistake you're making and be inactive and was able to rule over 127 provinces and save the Jewish people, even though she was the first generation after the destruction of the first temple, similar to you who are the first generation after the second temple? You know how Esther did it? Because she looked back and saw that she's a continuation, accumulation, all the way back from Sarah Imenu, and didn't look at herself as somebody independent, separate, disjointed from Jewish history. That was the idea. And that's what Rabbi Akiva told his students, to get them to be dynamic. But they obviously didn't react properly. And they remained with that mistake. And they didn't appreciate who they were and who each and every one was, so they didn't respect each other with the full respect they should have. They looked at their Torah in a very narrow way, and therefore they didn't feel it was worth spreading it. And because of that, because that was their role, to spread Torah, to be those who would be the midgets on the giants' shoulders, who would be the next link in Jewish tradition, therefore they died. They weren't able to fulfill their purpose. If you can't fulfill your purpose, you can't be in this world. And Rabbi Akiva had 5 later Talmidim who understood who they were, and who understood that even though they were midgets, but they're midgets on the giant shoulders, they can accomplish even more than that giant from behind. They understood they were a continuation of Jewish history. And the truth is, this concept of accumulation is a very important one. And it applies both to Rabbi Akiva and to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who are significant today on Lag BaOmer. The Gemara says that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was in a cave. He spoke badly about the Roman government, and they were hunting for him to kill him. So he went and hid in a cave with his son, Rabbi Lezer, and they were in the cave for 12 years. And then, a heavenly voice, and all they did in that cave for 12 years was daven and learn Torah. And God provided them with a carob tree to take care of their physical needs, and a brook for water, and they didn't have to do anything else except learn and daven. They were at a very high level. When they came out of the cave, so they were on such a high level, so spiritual, that when they saw people involved in earning a living, right, and plowing and planting and farming, right, they couldn't imagine how you could do that. Why could you waste time on trivial, mundane matters? They were involved in these eternal matters for 12 years, right, didn't have to worry about their physical being at all. It was all provided by God. Here are people wasting their time doing menial and mundane things, and wherever they looked, they burnt it up. They were so critical that they burnt up where they looked. Right? It just was burning criticism. So a heavenly voice resounded, I didn't send you out of the cave to destroy my world. Get back in the cave. So I went back to the cave for another year, and they came out, and now wherever Rebbe Lezer looked, he still burnt up the place. He still was very critical. But Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, his father, was able to heal it, put out the fire, and heal it. So 3 things bothered me about this. Okay? 2 are the following. If you would ask me, why were they so critical? Because they spent 12 years in a cave, right, on a totally high spiritual level, separated from the realities of this material world. So what in the world is going to help to put them back in the cave for another year? It's going to make them worse. Send them to Miami for a year. That will mellow them, right? Don't send them back into the cave. And secondly, okay, after the year's up, they come out. Rebbe Lezer's still burning up the place. Put him back in the cave again. Okay, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai got the message. But his son didn't. Why leave him out? Send him back. Why is it okay? I think you see from here 3 things. First of all, we many times think that people are overly critical because they've learned too much. They're too much into learning, and they're not into the realities of the world. That's why they're critical. What do you see from this story? That people are overly critical because they haven't learned enough. But if you learn more, you'll be able to know how to be more tolerant. You'll be able to be... Great people are very tolerant. It's the people who are not so great that are intolerant. So putting them back in the cave for another year is going to help. It's the first thing you learn. Second thing, tolerance is very nice. But you can't say everything is, I'm okay, you're okay, and everybody's okay. And if everybody's okay, nobody's okay. Because then you never improve. Then you never correct the things that need to be corrected. So you need a balance. You need 2 eyes. You need the hot blood of youth that are constantly critical, right? And you need the mellow eyes of an older person that can take that criticism and make it constructive criticism. When there's a balance, when there's a Rebbe Lezer who's burning up the world, but there's a Rav Shimon Bar Yochai who knows to take that and make it into something constructive and positive, that's great. Either one by itself, both of them burning up the world, is no good. Both of them looking complacently, everything's okay, is no good. That's why it says that Bilam Harasha only had 1 eye. He only saw things critical. He was Bilam. Right? People who have only 1 eye and only see everything rosy are not the kind of people that can make an impression on this world, because they'll never correct anything. Everything is fine. It's only people with 2 eyes, 1 critical and 1 able to turn that criticism into constructive criticism, that's fine. So as long as there's a Rebbe Lezer, the hot-blooded youth, together with the venerated sage who can see things properly, you can leave them both out. When they're both critical, then send them back in. But the third thing you see from there is, so what's 1 more year going to help? But it's not 1 more year. It's the accumulation now of 13 years. It's not just another year. But they didn't finish, what they accumulated in 12 years wasn't enough. So 1 more year is now going to give them the accumulation of 13 with the original 12 too. That's a different story. Where do you see this by Rabbi Akiva? So that's Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. According to some, this is the day of his yahrzeit. This is the day when he got smicha. Whatever happened, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is significant to Lag BaOmer. How about Rabbi Akiva, who's also significant to Lag BaOmer? It says Rabbi Akiva, when he got married to the daughter of Kalba Savua, to Rocha, so she saw in him the potential that he had, even though he was a total ignoramus. He was a nice person, the Gemara says, even though he did not like Talmidei Chachamim, but Tosa says he was a Balmidos, he was a refined person, but he never learned anything. He knew nothing. So, but his wife saw right, what potential he had, and she married him. Her father did not see that potential, and he disowned her. How could you marry this ignoramus shepherd, right? Bring shame to our. So he disowned her, and she lived with Rabbi Akiva in abject poverty. They had to sleep on straw. But she suffered with that in order that her husband would become the Talmid Chacham that she knew he could become, and she was right. He became Rabbi Akiva. So he went away to learn for 12 years. 12 years she sent her husband away to sit and learn Torah. Okay, what a sacrifice of a wife. Right? Unless you don't like your husband. But she loved her husband. But she was willing to sacrifice. 12 years he went away to learn Torah, and then he came back. Came back after 12 years, an accomplished Talmid Chacham. And he came to the house, standing on the porch, and he hears the following exchange between his wife and a neighbor. The neighbor says, "What kind of scoundrel of a husband do you have? The guy leaves you for 12 years. He hasn't seen you for 12 years. This is your husband?" And his wife says, "If he would go for another 12 years, I'd be happy too. I want him to be the biggest Talmid Chacham he can be." Rabbi Akiva lived 120 years, so they had plenty of years together, despite the 24 years. But she said, if I could, I'd send him away for another 12 years. He'd even be a bigger Talmid Chacham. Rabbi Akiva heard that, turned around, went back to learn for 12 more years. So they asked, okay, look, you want to go back. Your wife gave you permission. Really a special tzaddikus. Go in and say hello. You haven't seen the woman for 12 years. Don't turn around and go back. Come in, say hello, spend a day at least at home, and then say, I'm so happy that you gave me permission to go on 12 years, I'm going back another 12 years. He didn't even come in and say hello. He didn't tell his wife he was home. He turned around and went back. Why? Tells the Rosh Hashiva, because 2 times 12 is not the same thing as 1 times 24. Had he gone in, he would have made a break between the first 12 years and the second 12 years. So he would have had 12 years of learning and another 12 years. But if he didn't make the break, he went right back, he had 24 years. Based on what we're saying, makes sense. If you accumulate, an accumulation of 24 years is different than accumulating 12 and then starting again and accumulating another 12. But if the 13th year is not 1 year, it's now 13 years of power. The 14th year is the 14 years. But if you break it up, then the second 12 is just 1, and then 2, and then the accumulation of 3. It's a completely different thing. Now you have an accumulation of 24, right? Not the accumulation of 2 times 12. So that's also significant to Rabbi Akiva. And in fact, there's another significance to Rabbi Akiva of this lesson of accumulation. They say, what gave Rabbi Akiva the feeling that his wife was right, that he could eventually become a big Talmid Chacham, even though at 40 years old he was an ignoramus? He saw the following. He saw water dripping on a stone, and it had eroded a hole in this big stone. And he said, if water, which is so soft, can erode stone, which is so hard, then Torah, which is so hard, can really make inroads on my heart, which is so soft. That's what he saw. He saw erosion. And he learned from that he could be a Talmid Chacham. And many people have seen erosion, studied it, made papers on it, and have not become Rabbi Akiva. Right? You have to see it and internalize it. That makes a difference to you. But in any case, what's erosion? Erosion tells me every little drop of water cannot erode stone. Now, impossible. You take drops of water, you can put them on a stone for 1,000 years, you'll never erode the stone. What erodes it? The accumulation of all of those drops, one after the other. It's when you accumulate all those drops together, without a break between them. It's not a drop here and a drop there. It's a continuation, a constant accumulation of water on stone. That's going to cause erosion. So Rabbi Akiva learned that lesson also, this idea of accumulation, and that all is the idea of Sfiras HaOmer. And therefore, Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, who didn't learn this lesson, and they didn't learn it during Sfiras HaOmer when they're supposed to understand this idea of accumulation. And if you understand the idea of accumulation, the power of adding to what came before and adding it to what you have now. They would have appreciated who they were. But they didn't learn that lesson from Sfiras HaOmer. That's why they died during Sfiras HaOmer. When did they stop dying? When that lesson became very, very obvious on Lag BaOmer. How is that? So let me tell you what the Moshav says about Lag BaOmer. And based on that, you can understand this day symbolizes the idea of accumulation. How so? The Gemara says in Moed Katan that when a person lives most of his life and he hasn't yet sinned in a major way, he can be assured that he's not going to sin the rest of his life. It's already created a situation where he's safe. No, he has a free way to the end. What's considered most of your life? So what would you say most of a person's life is? So if a lifespan is 70 years, I would say 36 years. Yeah. If a lifespan is 120 years, so I would say, 61 years. What's the Gemara say? When a person's lived most of his life, it's 52 years. And that was the length of life of Shmuel Hanavi, 52 years. So the Moshav says, where in the world do we find a lifetime called 52 years as majority of life? That means life would have to be 103 years. Right? Where is there a lifespan of 103 years? It's called a normal lifespan, that most of your life is 52 years. So he explains it in the following way. He says a person's Torah lifespan is 70 years. Right? 70 years. The first 20 years of life don't count because you're not held responsible in the heavenly court till you're 20. So take away the 20 years. What does that leave in a person's life? 50 years. 50 years. Okay? 49 and the 50 if you graduate out of this world. Okay. 50 years. 49 years. It says majority does not mean a simple majority. Majority means if you divide it into three parts, two of those parts, two-thirds, a two-thirds majority, that's called majority. So now, if you have 49 years of active life, and the 50th year is the graduation, and you divide it into three parts, what do you get? 16 and a fraction, right? 16 and a third years, okay? When is the majority of a person's life? After two of those portions go away, which is 32 and a fraction, and two-thirds. Add that to the original 20. Well, how old are you? 52. So when your 52 years go by, you have majority of your life. Says the Moshav, that's the same thing we do when it comes to Pesach and Sfiras HaOmer. It patterns itself after this. He says, if according to one opinion, the world was created in Nisan. Rabbi Yeshua holds the world was created in Nisan. That doesn't mean, though, the world was created on the first day of Nisan. It means that Adam Harishon, the first man, was created the first day of Nisan. So when was the world created? 6 days earlier, which was the 25th day of Adar. The world was created on the 25th day of Adar, and the 6th day of creation was the first day of Nisan. If you take from the 25th day of Adar till the 15th day of Nisan, which is the first day of Pesach, is 20 days. Those days don't count, because those are like the first 20 years of a person's life, that they don't count. So when do you start counting? After the 15th day of Nisan, the next day, which is the 16th day, when we start counting the Omer. How many days do you count? 49 days. And the 50th day is the giving of the Torah, similar to a person's life. When does the majority of that time go by that you can feel that you've accumulated enough to really have a basis for the future? After 32 days pass by, which is the 33rd day, which means Lag BaOmer. That's what Lag BaOmer is all about, says the Moshav. Lag BaOmer is the day that you've accumulated enough of the majority of those days of the 49 where it becomes already something that now you're set for the future. So on the Lag BaOmer, you feel that idea of accumulation. You've accumulated enough. You've made enough. You have a 33-day power, which is the majority of the totality, which now puts you on the course for the end. So on the day when you really feel that accumulation, then the sin of Talmidei Rabbi Akiva who didn't understand that you look at Jewish history as an accumulation, not as separate, disjointed, individual things. But we are all standing on the giant of tradition from Avram Avinu and Sarah Imenu. We're standing on their shoulders and the shoulders of everybody who came after them, before us. We are midgets, we're little fleas. But we're fleas on the top of the head of those giants, and we're even higher than the giant. That's how we have to look at ourselves. Right? We're taka fleas. You compare us to previous generations, any generation you want to. Who are we? What can we accomplish? But if we understand that Jewish history is not every generation to itself, but we are the continuation of a glorious past that spans from Avram Avinu and Sarah Imenu till today. And we're on the heads of those people who left Egypt, and on the heads of those people who were the Nevi'im, and those people who were in the first Beis HaMikdash, and the second Beis HaMikdash, and the Nevi'im, the Tanoim, Amoraim, the great Torah leaders of the past. And we're standing on their heads, on their shoulders, then we're pretty important. And we can accomplish a tremendous amount. And we won't be inactive, menamning, like the Talmidim Rabbi Akiva, but each and every one of us will feel that glorious past that we are part of and want to continue it to the future. And therefore, I may be ignorant, I may not know too much about that past, but I'm situated, if I put myself firmly on the shoulders of those that came before me, it gives me a tremendous responsibility to be the ones that the next generation will stand on my shoulders, me on top of them. And if I want to be that kind of person that can be the person who will be the base for future generations, then I have to get firmly on the shoulders of that giant and learn and be able to observe and be that kind of person that can say at least that I'm standing on the shoulders of a giant. And then I'll become part of that giant, that other midgets who come after me can become giants too and put themselves on my shoulders. And that's what the JLE is all about. To take all these midgets, all of us, and to give us a chance to recognize where we're standing vis-a-vis Jewish history, where we emanate from. We're not just standing in a vacuum, but we are the continuation of Jewish history, of a Jewish heritage that spans generations, giants before us. And then we can know how to situate ourselves on the shoulders of those giants so we can be the base for the generations to come, ad bias kol tzedek, until Mashiach comes in Herav Yamin. Amen.